In the frozen forests of Montana, a veteran ranger lay bound to a pine tree, certain he would die alone. As the wolves cried in the distance and his strength faded, a massive shape emerged through the falling snow. No one could have imagined what happened next. The Kodiak bear that approached him wasn't there to kill. What it chose to do instead began an unbelievable story, one of wild loyalty, quiet mercy, and a bond that defied every line between man and beast. The first thing Ethan Walker felt was the bite of cold in his teeth, as if winter itself were trying to pry his jaw apart. He opened his eyes to a sky the color of old pewter and tried to swallow, but his throat was dry and tight, scraped by air that smelled like iron and sap. His shoulders screamed when he moved. Steel cable bit into his wrists where they were cinched behind a thick lodgepole pine. A second loop pinned his ankles so tight his toes had gone numb. Snow feathered down through the branches and dusted his coat, melting into a thin, cruel wetness that soaked without mercy. He remembered the men first, their breath clouding in the cold, the way they kept their faces low in their hoods, the sour smell of gasoline on their gloves. He remembered finding their line of snares at dawn, the fresh blood in the snow no larger than a coin, enough to tell him the trap had caught something small and terrified. He remembered raising his voice, telling them they were done here, that the citations he'd written before weren't warnings anymore. The oldest one had laughed softly, as if Ethan were a boy lecturing his elders. Then the butt of a rifle slid across his temple, and the world buckled. Now the world had sharpened into slow pain. A wind moved down from the high bowl and set the trees to whispering. Somewhere beyond sight, a raven clacked a dry note. Ethan tested the cable. The strands didn't groan, they didn't move at all. Whoever put him here had looped the steel around the trunk twice and driven the swagged sleeve flat with a hammer. He'd taught rookie rangers to look for that kind of work. Never the quick knot, always the permanent one. He tilted his head and listened. The forest answered with ordinary life, twig snaps, snow sliding from limb to limb, until a thin, mechanical whine needled the air above the breeze. He lifted his eyes as far as the cable allowed. A small quadcopter drifted against the gray sky, its shell matte black, a glassy eye glinting. It hovered longer than curiosity allowed, adjusted to keep him centered, then slid away toward the north, the sound fading like a mosquito vanishing into another room. They were watching. They had made a choice about what they wanted the cold to do. He thought of the trail map in his head. The service road to the south buried under last week's storm, the creek to the east glazing into ice, the station cabin 15 kilometers away. 15 could be a morning's walk with firm ground and a thermos. It might as well have been across an ocean with his wrists eaten by cable and the first numb stone of thirst already lodged in his mouth. He had his radio when he left before daylight. He remembered pressing the talk key once, then only snow and static. They'd smashed it. They hadn't taken his name badge, though. He could feel the rectangle under his jacket. The petty cruelty of leaving it there stung as odd proof of his own body. By noon the cold grew thinner, the kind that tricks a man, and sunlight salted down between clouds in a brief flare. The reprieve lasted minutes. Cloud closed the hole. The light went flat again. Time began to slide. He could measure it only by the quiet urgencies of his body. The small shiver that built into a long one he couldn't suppress. The dry ache beneath his tongue. The way his thoughts widened, then narrowed to a single point and back again. When the first wolf howl came, a low note rolled across the timber. It set a simple fact in the snow with him. He was meat that couldn't run. Another answered, higher, not far. Ethan turned his head and saw only trees that looked like soldiers shouldering snow. He breathed through his nose, slow, the way he'd told hikers to breathe when panic was waiting just behind their teeth. Count to 5. Count again. He told himself that a single wolf didn't come to test men. It was the pack that did that, and even then rarely. The flurrying in his chest ignored reason. As the light failed, his mind slipped down old corridors. He saw his father's barn in Missouri, frost filigree on a murky window. He heard his mother call him in from chore with a voice that always wore laughter around its edges. He saw his first bear print in Montana 20 years ago. The way the pads looked like a human palm had been pressed into mud, ancient and familiar at once. He saw a little brown cub with burrs stuck in its ears and a loop of wire pulled tight under its chin. No, not yet. Don't go there. Not while your breath fogs and the cable hasn't given a millimeter. Memory could be a warm stove, or it could be a hole in the ice. He kept his eyes open. Snow began to thicken as afternoon tilted toward evening. The drone returned once, then twice, humming a loose circle wider each time, until the wind drew a lace of blown flakes across the clearing and hid it. He wondered if the men were near, watching from the tree line. Wondered what it would take for them to be satisfied. 3 hours more. 3 days. He strained at the cable until sparks flared in his skull and stars popped behind his eyes, ridiculous and bright. Twilight seeped in like cold dye poured into water, filling every shape. The wolves called again, closer now, a broken cord stepping over itself. Ethan closed his eyes and made a bargain with the dark. If you'll let me keep my hands, I'll keep my head. He began to talk in a voice he barely recognized, a rasp that seemed to belong to another man in another life. You will not take me, he told the cable. You will not take me, he told the dusk. He said it until the saying itself felt like a wire held in the teeth of this world. Then the forest went quiet. No branch creaked. No bird scolded. The quiet arrived the way it does when something large moves without hurry. It pressed on the snow, settled on his shoulders, stopped the wind, as if a hand had paused a metronome. Ethan opened his eyes. At the edge of the clearing, between the laddered trunks, a shape detached itself from shadow. Broad across the chest, heavy in the shoulders, its fur darkened by wet snow to a deep brown that drank the last light, the bear came on with the calm of a creature that had never wasted a step. It was larger than any grizzly he'd met at a distance on summer patrol. The animal paused, steam lifting from its muzzle. The air filled with a smell that carried through the cold, earth and hide, and something like sun-warmed penny copper. The bear lowered its head and swung it once, left to right, reading him the way bears do, taking in story from scent. It did not rise onto its hind legs to threaten. It did not blow and ground chop the way a bear will when it wants something gone. It exhaled and stepped closer. Snow squeaked under the weight. Ethan felt the cable cutting fresh into his wrists as his body tried to back away without permission. The animal's eyes were small and dark and alive, and in them he saw neither hunger nor haste, only a patient attention that made his ribs ache with a feeling he could not yet name. The wind shifted and carried to the bear the iron tang of steel, the stink of glove and gasoline that clung to the cable. The bear's ears pinned back for a heartbeat. It reached its blunt snout toward the loop cinched at Ethan's ankles and drew a hard breath. A sound rolled up from its chest, not the roar of fury, but a low, displeased rumble, as if something old and mean had been recognized. Ethan swallowed hard. Easy, he whispered, the word breaking in half in the cold. The bear's head lifted at his voice and held his gaze for the space of a long breath. Somewhere far off, a wolf answered itself and faded. Snow fell in soft, steady threads. The bear took one more step, close enough now that Ethan felt the rise of its heat through his frozen jeans. It touched the cable with the side of its jaw, flinched at the wire's bite, then turned its great head toward the hammered sleeve crimped against the pine. The rumble deepened. Muscles bunched beneath the winter coat. Ethan, pinned and trembling, could only watch as the animal settled its weight, as if testing the tree, as if deciding what effort the cold metal would require. For a long moment the bear did not move. Snow drifted over its back, clinging to the guard hairs along its shoulders. Ethan felt the animal's breath against his boots, warm, earthy, carrying a faint musk that reminded him of early spring days when the thaw wakes the soil. Then, with a slow and deliberate shift of weight, the bear pressed its shoulder against the pine. The trunk groaned, sending a pulse through the cables that rattled Ethan's bones. He braced himself, uncertain whether the beast meant to free him or crush him where he sat. The bear stepped back and inspected the cable again. Its head swung low, jaws parting slightly as it tested the scent. Something in that scent angered it. A deep vibration rose from its chest, not a roar, but a warning drawn from the oldest parts of the forest. The bear turned toward Ethan, its eyes catching a glint of the fading day. For an instant he saw something that stopped his breath, a flicker of recognition, faint but unmistakable. It couldn't be. Not here. Not like this. But the thought came anyway, pushing through the cold fog in his skull. 3 years ago, a ranger from the northern district had called him about a report. Crying in a ravine, the sound too weak to be a human child, too frantic to be nothing. Ethan had hiked in at dusk, sliding down a slope slick with meltwater, and nearly stepped on the tiny body of a bear cub tangled in a poacher's snare. Its cry had been thin, a ribbon of pain unraveling into the evening air. The wire had eaten into the cub's neck, leaving a wound shaped like a cruel half-moon. He remembered kneeling in the mud, his hands shaking not from fear, but from fear of doing the wrong thing. "Easy, little one," he'd murmured, the same way he now murmured to hikers who twisted an ankle, or children who lost the trail. The cub had fought at first, weakly, then with a sudden surge of terror when he'd touched the snare. He'd covered its eyes with his glove and breathed slow, so it could feel the rhythm of something steady. When the wire finally came free, the cub collapsed against his leg, too tired to bite, too scared to run. He'd carried it out like a sleeping dog, its heartbeat fluttering like a trapped moth against his chest. They'd kept the cub at the rescue center for 2 weeks. Ethan had fed it broth with a rubber-tipped bottle, cleaned its wound with warm saline, slept on a cot near its pen so it wouldn't wake alone to the night noises that scared it. Even when it grew strong enough to nip at his wrist or tumble playfully in the straw, the cub would often sit and watch him with eyes full of quiet questions. When the day came to release it back to the wild, it hesitated at the edge of the trees, turning to stare at him with a look he had not forgotten, a look that asked something he didn't know how to answer. Now the memory surged, sharp as the cold. Ethan blinked, cleared his vision, and saw it. The faint crescent scar under the bear's heavy winter fur. The same place where the wire had bitten the cub long ago. "God," he whispered, "it's you." The bear's head lifted at the sound of his voice. Snowflakes clung to its muzzle, melting into droplets that glimmered like tiny beads of glass. It stepped closer. Ethan held his breath as the animal leaned down and pressed the side of its jaw gently against the cable, as if confirming it was the source of the wrongness it smelled. Then, in a sudden burst of power, the bear struck the cable with its forepaw. The steel snapped taut with a twang that echoed through the clearing. The tree shuddered, shedding a gust of snow that pattered across Ethan's shoulders. The bear struck again, claws raking the sleeve that locked the cable around the trunk. Sparks flickered where claw met metal. Ethan flinched as pain shot up his arms from the sudden jerk, but hope, thin, trembling, impossible, began to breathe inside him. The bear backed up, planted its massive paws in the snow, and lunged its weight into the trunk. This time the pine bent more noticeably. The hammered sleeve creaked, and Ethan felt the tension in the cable loosen by a fraction no wider than a fingernail. But a fraction was enough to make his heart quicken. A high whine cut through the air. The drone was back. It hovered above the treetops, its dark eye fixed on the scene below. The bear ignored it, but Ethan's pulse spiked as he understood what the machine meant. The poachers were watching, and the sight of a bear helping him was not something they would let stand. Men who valued profit more than life, men who thought cruelty was power, those men would return. The drone dipped lower, its little rotors tilting as if trying to get a clearer angle. The bear turned its head at the sound and gave a low growl, deep and impatient. It did not like being watched. Ethan's mouth went dry for a new reason. "Come on," he whispered to the bear. "Before they get here. Please." The bear didn't understand the words, but it understood the urgency. It surged up onto its hind legs, an immense, towering silhouette against the gray sky, and slammed its full weight into the tree. The impact cracked through the clearing like a gunshot. The trunk bowed, the sleeve split with a metallic shriek, and suddenly Ethan pitched sideways as the cable slackened. He gasped as the steel bit once more, then loosened, then, wonder of mercies, gave way altogether. His arms, numb and deadened, fell limp to his sides. The cable around his ankles sagged. He collapsed into the snow, breath knocking from his lungs. For a moment, he could only lie there, the cold biting but freedom sweeter than warmth. The bear lowered itself beside him, studying him with that same questioning gaze it once had as a cub. It nudged his shoulder with its nose, a careful, almost tender gesture. "Thank you," Ethan rasped, though his lips barely moved. The drone gave a sudden accelerating whine. It was retreating, fast. Not good. They weren't giving up. They were regrouping. The bear stiffened, ears pricked. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind carried a distant, ragged howl. Not a wolf's this time. Not an animal at all. A man shouting. Another answering. Boots breaking crusted. Snow. They were coming. Ethan forced himself onto his elbows, pain blooming in every joint. The bear stood protectively over him, shoulders rising and falling with slow breaths. "Easy," Ethan whispered again, but this time not to calm the bear. This time to steady himself for whatever was about to break through the trees. The forest held its breath, and then the first crack of a branch sounded from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle bolt sliding into place. The sound of the rifle bolt froze the clearing the way a sudden frost grips a window pane. Ethan forced himself upright, though his arms trembled beneath him like branches loaded with snow. The bear shifted its stance, angling its massive body between him and the trees. Its breath steamed in slow, measured clouds. It wasn't fear that moved through the animal. It was readiness, ancient and patient, the kind that had kept its kind alive through storms fiercer than this. A figure emerged from the timberline, then another. The poachers were back, 3 of them this time, moving with the wary steps of men who had spent their lives taking what the forest never offered freely. Their hoods were pulled low, their rifles raised, eyes fixed on the bear as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. "Back away from it!" one man shouted. But the command felt hollow, aimed at a creature that did not obey the language of thieves. The bear lowered its head, ears flat, the hair along its spine rising in a slow wave. Ethan could feel the rumble building in its chest, a sound that wasn't meant for him, but traveled through the snow and into his bones. The poachers hesitated, and in that hesitation, the wind changed. It carried another voice, one that slipped down the ridge in broken notes, a howl. Then another. The wolves had returned. Ethan's stomach tightened. The scent of his blood, smeared across the cable cuts on his wrists and ankles, had drawn them closer. In this country, wolves didn't approach men unless hunger pressed them hard, or unless something more dangerous chased them into a corner. The poachers glanced sideways, startled. One turned his head just enough to catch the flicker of movement in the shadows. "They're circling," he muttered under his breath. The bear stood its ground, but its posture sharpened. It wasn't the rifles that concerned it now. It was what waited in the dark edges of the forest. A wolf stepped into view, its gray coat blending almost perfectly into the twilight. It stared at Ethan first, then at the bear. A low growl rattled from its throat. The trees behind it rustled with the approach of the pack. 7 wolves, silent except for the whisper of paws on fresh snow. The poachers had wanted control of this clearing. They had lost it. One of them lifted his rifle, panic leaking into his voice. "We need to go!" But before he could take a step, the lead wolf lunged. The clearing erupted. The bear moved, faster than seemed possible for something its size. It surged forward, intercepting the wolf mid-charge, knocking it sideways with a swipe that sent a spray of snow into the air. Two more wolves darted at the bear's hind legs. One managed to clamp its jaws into the thick muscle. The bear roared. A true roar this time, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to shake loose the last light of day. Ethan pushed himself up, though every movement burned. His legs wobbled beneath him. The poachers backed away, trying to retreat, but the fight was spreading, unpredictable and wild. Another wolf, smaller but faster, bolted straight toward Ethan, drawn by the weakness radiating from him like heat from a dying fire. Ethan grabbed the nearest thing he could reach, half a broken branch buried in the snow. His fingers could barely wrap around it, but he lifted it anyway. When the wolf sprang, he swung. The branch cracked across the wolf's muzzle, knocking it sideways. It yelped and spun back into the tree line, startled more than hurt. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought he might collapse again, but he forced his feet to stay planted. The old ranger in him, the one who had weathered blizzards, rescued hikers, and tracked wounded animals for miles, rose up against the cold, trying to drag him under. Another wolf leapt toward the bear's flank. The bear pivoted, jaws snapping shut just inches from fur. Snow exploded beneath their weight. The poachers scrambled backward, tripping over roots and each other. One fired a shot without aiming. The crack of the rifle split the air. The bullet hit the bear. Not deep, just a graze across the shoulder. But the shock of it ripped a roar from the animal so fierce that even the wolves hesitated. "Stop shooting!" Ethan's voice tore out, hoarse and raw. "You'll kill us all!" The man who'd fired looked wildly from the bear to the pack, and then turned and bolted into the forest. The others followed, stumbling over their own panic, vanishing into the dimming light as if swallowed whole. But the wolves remained. The bear, bleeding now from the graze and from the bite on its hind leg, planted its paws firmly in the snow. It drew itself up to full height. Even the wolves paused at that. In the gathering dusk, the bear was a dark mountain rising. Two wolves attacked at once. The bear dropped back to all fours and met them with raw, brutal force. One wolf was caught by the shoulder and flung aside. The other latched onto the bear's forearm. The bear twisted, pinning the wolf beneath its weight until the animal's grip loosened. Ethan saw another wolf circling behind the bear, eyes locked on the vulnerable angle of its ribcage. He didn't think. Thought didn't matter anymore. He snatched a stone from the snow, fist-sized and cold as death, and hurled it with what little strength he had left. The stone struck the wolf squarely between the ears. It yelped, staggering sideways before retreating into the shadows. The poachers said. Bear turned its head toward Ethan. In those dark eyes he saw it, the same surprise he had seen years ago when the cub realized the man holding it meant no harm. And layered beneath that surprise was something deeper, older, gratitude. The remaining wolves regrouped, circling one more time, testing. But the bear stood tall, bleeding but unbroken, and the pack understood what the forest had already decided. They would not win here. One by one, they backed away, fading into the dark until their shapes dissolved into the moving shadows of the timberline. The clearing fell quiet, except for the wind, rising again as though to sweep away the violence it had witnessed. Ethan's knees buckled. The bear stepped toward him, its breathing heavy and rough. It lowered itself carefully, almost gently, onto one knee, its muzzle brushing the snow as if gathering strength. Ethan reached for its fur, his fingers trembling as they touched the thick winter coat. The bear didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned ever so slightly into the contact. "I'm not leaving you," Ethan whispered, though his voice cracked with exhaustion. "Not after what you've done." The bear blinked slowly, its breath warming the cold air between them. In the growing darkness, the two figures, man and bear, knelt together in the snow, bound not by fear, not by instinct, but by a shared debt written into the deep, ancient memory of the wild. Night settled over the mountains with a heaviness that made the world feel older than it was. The last traces of the battle faded into the snow, paw prints already softening at the edges, droplets of blood turning dark as they froze. Ethan pushed himself upright, though every muscle protested. The bear rose beside him, breathing hard, each exhale a plume that drifted upward like smoke from a winter chimney. The wind thickened, carrying the scent of spruce and distant ice. Ethan steadied himself against the bear's shoulder. "We need to move," he whispered, unsure if the words were meant for the animal or for his own weakening resolve. The bear didn't need language. It shifted its body so Ethan could lean more comfortably, then took the first slow step toward the ridge. The snow deepened with every yard. The storm had softened the landscape into a white, rolling silence, broken only by the crunch of the bear's weight forging a path. Ethan followed close behind, his fingers clutching tufts of fur when his balance faltered. His vision blurred at the edges. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and thirst had carved a raw pit into his throat. But the bear moved with steady purpose, never hurrying, always checking that he was still upright. They climbed a slope where wind scoured the ground bare, revealing patches of frozen dirt. Ethan stumbled on a root, nearly falling forward. The bear halted immediately, turning its head to nudge him upright with a gentleness he remembered from the cub that once leaned nervously against his knee. "You're still the same," Ethan murmured, breath trembling. "Bigger, tougher, but the same heart." The bear blinked slowly, as if accepting the truth of that. Halfway across the ridge, a branch snapped somewhere behind them. Ethan whipped his head around, pulse surging. But it wasn't wolves. It was only the forest settling into the cold, trees shifting under their burden of snow. Still, his mind chased shadows, the memory of rifle fire echoing too fresh to ignore. He forced himself onward, letting the bear's size feel like a shield against the night. The descent from the ridge grew treacherous. Snow collected in deep drifts, swallowing Ethan's boots up to the knee. Twice he collapsed, his legs unable to obey. The second time, he fell hard enough that the world spun. He tasted blood where his lips split on the ice. The bear turned back, lowering itself until its massive head was level with his chest. It nudged him firmly, as if refusing to let him sink into the snow and sleep. Ethan knew what that sleep meant. He had seen its quiet finality in hikers who didn't make it home. "All right," he whispered, gripping the animal's fur. "Help me up." With effort, he rose again. The bear walked slower now, closer, allowing Ethan to keep a hand on its shoulder. Each step felt like lifting a boulder. He counted them silently, the way he used to count breaths during long rescues. One step for every person he'd brought home. One step for the cub he once carried out of a ravine. One step for the life he still hoped he had left to live. Time slipped strangely. The moon crept between clouds, illuminating the snow with a soft blue glow. In that light, the bear's fur shimmered as though threaded with silver. Ethan could almost pretend they weren't two weary creatures fighting the cold, but travelers sharing an unspoken promise. When they reached the valley floor, Ethan recognized a shape rising from the darkness. A crooked spruce he knew well, bent by storms years ago. His heart tightened. The station wasn't far now. If he could just stay conscious a little longer. They continued through the narrow corridor of trees until a faint, warm light flickered in the distance. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of exhaustion. But as they drew closer, the light solidified. The lantern outside the station cabin, swinging gently in the wind. He exhaled a sound that broke somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "We made it," he whispered. "We actually made it." The bear halted. Ethan took 2 steps before realizing the animal was no longer beside him. He turned back. The bear stood with its head slightly lowered, breath rising in slow clouds. It didn't take a step forward. Instead, it looked past Ethan, toward the open stretch of forest behind them. Footsteps broke through the snow, human steps. Ethan's fellow rangers burst from the cabin, flashlights sweeping wildly. When they saw him, their shouts echoed across the yard, clearing. "Ethan! Walker, is that you? Get him inside!" They ran toward him, 3 men, 1 woman, all armed, all terrified at what they saw, their senior ranger staggering toward them beside a massive Kodiak bear. "Get back!" one ranger cried, lifting his rifle. "Ethan, move away from it." "No!" Ethan raised his hands with the last of his strength. "Don't shoot! It's not... It saved me!" The bear lifted its head at the noise, but made no threatening move. The rangers hesitated, but fear painted their faces. They had seen too many encounters and badly to trust the moment. Ethan stepped between them and the bear. His legs trembled so violently he nearly dropped to his knees. "Lower the guns," he pleaded. "Please. This bear protected me. If you fire, it'll defend itself, and none of us wants that." The rangers exchanged uncertain glances. The woman, Jenna, lowered her rifle first. She'd known Ethan the longest. She trusted the calm in his voice, more than the fear in their own. One by one, the others lowered their weapons. Relief washed over Ethan so strongly he had to brace himself. He turned back to the bear. For a breath, neither moved. The clearing seemed to hold its own heartbeat, slow and solemn. The bear took a single step forward, not toward the rangers, but toward Ethan. It lowered its head until its muzzle nearly brushed his hand. Ethan reached out, resting his palm against the warm fur between its eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for my life, for everything." The bear closed its eyes for the briefest moment, then drew back. It turned toward the forest, the snow welcoming it like a familiar blanket. For a few seconds it lingered, looking over its shoulder at Ethan, with the same quiet gaze the cub once gave him at the edge of the trees. Then it walked away. Its massive form faded into the dark pines, footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. Ethan watched until the last shadow vanished, and still he listened, hoping for one more sound, one more goodbye carried by the wind. But the forest offered only silence. His knees finally gave out. The rangers caught him before he hit the ground, their voices blending into a blur of concern. Ethan looked toward the place where the bear had disappeared. "He remembered me," he whispered, a tear warming his cheek despite the cold. "After all these years, he remembered." The lantern light flickered once more, casting a golden glow across the snow. Ethan allowed himself to be carried toward the cabin, his body nearly spent, but his heart fuller than it had been in a very long time. In the hush of the Montana night, with the storm drifting quietly over the mountains, one truth lingered like breath on cold air. Kindness never dies in the wild. It simply finds its way home. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple 1 in the comments so I know you're here with me. Your little note means more than you think. And if you'd like to join us for the next touching wildlife story, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more incredible journeys waiting for you.